This Lent, we're exploring who killed Jesus.
Many people are convinced that they know the answer.
But we've gathered 16 suspects as we retrace the events of Holy Week in this special 6-week podcast.
With your help, we'll discover who really killed Jesus.
This podcast is a production of progressivechristianity.org
and University Christian Church, San Diego.
I'm Caleb Lines.
And I'm Marshela Salgado.
This is Who Killed Jesus, a true crime podcast, Episode 3, Teaching Tuesday and Woman's Wednesday. Welcome back to the Who Killed Jesus podcast, where we are retracing Jesus's actions and the events of Holy Week as we try to discover who really killed Jesus and why. So far, we've talked about Palm Sunday, where we see Jesus coming in and staging an anti-imperial protest against Rome as he comes in on a borrowed donkey and his peasant followers wave their palm branches and take off their cloaks, where on the other side of town, Pontius Pilate comes in with his war horses in this great display of Roman force. And then last week, we talked about Holy Monday, where Jesus stages another demonstration, this time in the temple, as he confronts the temple leaders and talks about how they are colluding with Rome. So we've developed a list of suspects, Marshela.
We have.
And some of them have stood out.
Some of them have stood out. So if you haven't heard the first or second episode of the podcast, I recommend going back so you can hear a little bit more about all the suspects. We have 16 plus a few others that people brought up. However, the past 2 weeks, some have stood out more than others, beginning with the Roman Empire. And that also includes Emperor Tiberius. We also have Pontius Pilate, which is a familiar name, and a lot of us already know a little bit more about his story and his role in all of this. One that I really like is Caiaphas, because that's not a name that we talk about a lot, or at least we didn't growing up at church very much. So he's the Jewish high priest. And then we have two very familiar groups, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So those are the suspects that have emerged over the past 2 weeks, just in the stories that we've told or heard from Palm Sunday and Monday.
And do any of those stand out to you? Do you like any of those suspects?
I mean, aside from the fact that I appreciate learning more about Caiaphas, the ones that really are standing out more than others are the Roman Empire, I think, as a whole for me, and a little bit more of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Never really been a big fan. I used to sing this song, I Don't Want to Be a Sheep. Did you ever hear that song?
No. Are you going to sing it for us?
Well, no, but there was one part where that went, I don't want to be a Pharisee. I don't want to be a Pharisee, because they're not fair, you see. I just want to be a sheep, Babbitt. And then the Sadducees, they're just so sad, you see. So anyway, I've
never heard that.
That set the stage for the Pharisees and Sadducees for me, so.
Okay.
There you go.
So they're standing out more in your mind.
They are a little bit more. Yeah.
I think I appreciated the delving in on Holy Monday to the different groups of leaders who were colluding with Rome and the ways that they were colluding with Rome.
Yeah.
And why Jesus might have been opposed to that. I thought that was really a very helpful explanation.
Definitely.
And so I think, those groups are standing out in my mind, as well as I see a lot of people kind of colluding together and standing against Jesus.
Yeah.
So today we're going to talk about how those events, Palm Sunday and Holy Monday, build on each other and lead into the rest of the week, especially Tuesday and Wednesday today.
Right.
And so at the beginning of this podcast, we said, nothing really happened on Tuesday and Wednesday.
That's what I thought. I thought we just skip right over that. And when we celebrate Holy Week, it's Palm Sunday and straight to Maundy Thursday. So I was joking with you that not much happened on Monday. And then last week I was like, Tuesday and Wednesday will be really easy. They're not.
They're not?
They're not.
Did something end up happening?
Quite a lot ended up happening. So much so that right at the beginning of chapter 2 in this book, they mentioned this is the longest passage, and so many things happened on Tuesday, and important things too when it came to Jesus Well, people trying to trap Jesus. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, so Tuesday ends up being the longest day of Holy Week in the Gospel of Mark, and there is a lot going on. And so I think that that's kind of surprising because we don't
Hmm.
often do a lot of things in the church to commemorate Tuesday or Wednesday.
Yeah.
And so they're kind of dead days. In fact, we were talking about what their names were, and we couldn't come up with the names for Tuesday, just Tuesday and Wednesday. But
Hmm.
the more we learned about Tuesday and Wednesday of Holy Week, the more we realized, well, actually, there's a lot of important stuff going on. And so
Yeah.
we decided that we needed to give them names,
Yes, they
like
should be
real
named.
names.
Yes, just like Maundy Thursday or
Yeah.
Good Friday.
Palm Sunday.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think they should have
They
names.
should have names. So
Yep.
I suggested Teaching Tuesday because I liked
Hmm.
the alliteration and because Jesus spends most of Tuesday teaching at the temple. Ooh, I like that. Teaching Tuesday at the temple.
Woo! There you go.
Oh, look at all
There's
that
your
alliteration
alliteration.
we
I
got.
like that. Teaching Tuesday at the temple.
Teaching Tuesday at the temple. But then I said,
Yeah.
Marshela, what should we name Wednesday? Because I don't like just Holy Tuesday, Holy Wednesday. These
Right.
days are important. They deserve their own names.
And they should help us remember
What
what happened
happened?
that day,
That's right.
right? I think. So,
I like that.
that was a harder one,
It
Wednesday,
was
because
hard.
there was
Yeah.
a lot happening. But the one thing that stood out the most to me was enough for me to call it Woman's Wednesday.
Woman's Wednesday.
Yes.
I like that because I have never heard anyone call the Wednesday of Holy Week
No.
Woman's Wednesday.
And the only time, well, I think there's two moments that we refer back to women on
Hmm.
Holy Week, depending
Yeah.
on who you're reading or what narrative you're trying to describe. Like we talk about the women who walked up to um oh my gosh, the tomb.
Yeah.
And so we hear about the women being the first to realize like, hey, Jesus is not here.
Right. Yeah.
And then sometimes we talk about the woman who anointed Jesus with
Uh-huh.
oil, right?
Right.
Um, so those two things, but they talk a little bit more about that in this chapter, and I
Yeah.
really, really appreciated that. And so it is a shorter section, but I think it's a really important section, and they mentioned that. They mentioned that.
Yeah.
So
I love that. Woman's Wednesday. And we'll talk
yes,
more about her. So we've got to cover 2 days today, Marshella. And the chapters that we're talking about in Borg and Crossings the last week were dense.
yes,
And there's actually a lot that happens on Tuesday and Wednesday. So I think we should probably spend less time talking about what we've talked about in previous weeks and move
perfect.
on into Tuesday and Wednesday. So we're going to take a quick break. We'll come back and we'll talk about Teaching Tuesday and Women's Wednesday.
Who Killed Jesus? A true crime podcast is a special 6-week exploration of who really killed Jesus and why.
This podcast is brought to you by ProgressiveChristianity.org, celebrating 30 years of reclaiming Jesus' original message of justice, peace, and liberation while proclaiming an intellectually honest Christianity.
And University Christian Church San Diego, an authentic, inclusive, and progressive congregation in the heart of San Diego's Hillcrest neighborhood that declares God's love for all people.
Welcome back to Who Killed Jesus. We're talking about Teaching Tuesday and Women's Wednesday. And so on Tuesday, what happens is Jesus spends the majority of his day teaching in the temple, and we'll talk more about that in just a moment. And then on Wednesday, Jesus is anointed by a woman, and then Judas decides to betray Jesus, and we get some interpretations of what is going to happen to Jesus in the future. So Tuesday is the longest day of
Yeah.
Holy Week in the Gospel of Mark. Were you surprised by some of the narrative that you were reading about?
Yeah, I was. I mean, we don't usually pay attention to Tuesday, but what I really loved learning more was they spent most of the day trying to trap Jesus, and not just like
Mm-hmm.
one group of people, but you had several groups of leaders
Yeah.
trying to trap Jesus. And the question why, like, why were they trying to trap him? Was it to so that they could accuse him
Yeah.
of, to give him reason to arrest him,
Yeah.
or why? So I appreciated like the different examples that they provided in there of how they tried to entrap him, and how he didn't fall for the trap. He was
That's right.
obviously he was a very smart individual, but I liked how he came back at them with um, asking deeper questions and not falling into the trap and challenging
Mm.
them
Mm.
too.
Yeah, it's clear that Borg and Crossan, too, were very impressed by Jesus's rhetorical skill and
Hmm.
savvy here to respond to people who were trying to trap him, and there was a real stake here.
Hmm.
There were stakes. There were things that could happen if he answered the wrong way. And so one thing that I was struck by that maybe I hadn't ever been struck by before was that Jesus had spent Monday engaging in this temple demonstration
Hmm.
to whatever degree that ended up being. And I thought, well, of course, the religious leaders were then not happy with
Hmm.
Jesus. I mean, just the day before, he had gone in and staged this anti temple demonstration.
Yeah.
And then the next day, he was out in the temple court
Hmm.
teaching and
Hmm.
saying things that were anti religious establishment. And so, two-thirds of this day is spent with Jesus and the religious leaders talking back
Hmm.
and forth to each other and is pretty confrontational. And
Right.
so to me, that made a lot of logical sense that
Hmm.
Jesus would have come in on Sunday, stage this anti-imperial protest, then on Monday, stage a protest against the religious leaders, and then on Tuesday he goes back to the temple and he begins teaching, and the religious leaders are out there saying, "What's up with you, dude? Why do you think you have the authority to do this?" And then
Right.
asking him a bunch of questions.
Hmm.
Was that something that followed pretty logically for you too?
Yeah, it did. It did. Again, it's something that we didn't talk about growing
Yeah,
up. We didn't, like we breeze right by it.
yeah,
But it was very intentional and yeah, just the order made
yeah.
sense
And
too.
Jesus wasn't kind of essay about it, or
Mm-mm.
he didn't, he wasn't
Right.
like, he was antagonistic. And
Mm-hmm.
he was implying that the Sadducees were greedy, that the
Mm-hmm.
Pharisees were concerned with the wrong stuff.
Right.
And a lot of these parables that Jesus ends up telling on Tuesday are parables that we then take out of context
Yes.
because we don't
Yeah.
realize that they're, like,
Yeah.
in Holy Week, or we don't do the work to, like, look and see where they actually are in the gospel. And so if you take
Right.
them out of context, they can mean completely different things.
Yeah.
But when
Yeah.
you ground them in their context, it's
Mm-hmm.
really pretty clear that Jesus isn't talking about apocalypticism, that
Right.
Jesus isn't talking about some otherworldly thing, but that Jesus is condemning
Mm-hmm.
the religious establishment and is trying to give his people hope in the midst of the collusion that they're doing with
Right.
Rome. And
Right.
for me, that was a really important realization about what
Mm-hmm.
was happening on Tuesday.
Yeah, I agree. And maybe this is a good point to mention that it is really important to read Mark within the context that Mark was writing the book.
Mm,
And you're
hmm.
saying, like, don't we pull these parables and these stories um out of context and it can take on its own interpretation. But Mark was very intentional in how he wrote. I appreciate that Borg and Crossan mentioned that,
Yeah,
because if we don't understand how he uses prophecy and history and then even the stories, right,
yeah.
we could badly misinterpret, which I think is what happens and what
Yes.
has
Mm,
happened
hmm.
in mainstream Christianity. We've just taken this all out of context. So looking at it from the way that Mark intended to write the book, looking at his literary style
Yeah.
brings so much more context to these stories and to the week and the progression of events and Jesus' intention in what he did during that week. So
Yeah.
Tuesday wasn't an accident. He didn't just happen to
Mm,
be in the
hmm.
temple and just be like, I'm just going to go hang out there today. Like, there was very much intention in being there and teaching. So yeah.
And you know that Mark's gospel was the first to be written, and we'll talk more about that in a minute, I think. But it means that when Matthew and Luke came along and they used Mark as their primary source,
Hmm.
that they then had to make some interpretive choices. Just as Mark, when he was telling the story,
Hmm.
at least 40 years after Jesus's crucifixion, that he had to make some interpretive choices about what he was going to say, that Matthew and Luke then took Mark's gospel and they reordered a lot of things. And so I think this is one of the really complicated things about biblical interpretation is that you can hear the same stories in different gospels, but the different gospel writers intended them to communicate different points.
Right.
And so when Mark's narratives are taken out and placed in a different order, then it makes them mean something else in the context of that gospel. So one of the examples that Borg and Crossing give is the fig tree, where Jesus curses the fig tree. We talked about this last week. And then he goes into the temple and then comes out and the fig tree has withered away. Right. And so in that context, it's clear that the fig tree is symbolic for the religious leaders, that they look like they're going to give fruit, right? But they don't give any fruit. It's a condemnation of the religious establishment, as we talked about last week. But Matthew, we lose that going into the temple piece. And Jesus just curses the fig tree, and then it withers away, and it makes Jesus seem like he's magical.
Right.
And so I think that's another important thing that has really been driven home for me as I've been reading the events of Holy Week, is that it's hard to keep track of these and to realize that the gospel writers made their own interpretive choices.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I fully agree. Yeah.
So, Marshela, one of the teachings that really stood out to me in this as an important example of how we need to keep the parables in their context is this, and not just parables, but all of the action in its context in the story, in the narrative, is the thing about the denarius and the render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's.
Yes.
Have you ever heard that before?
Yes, and I've heard it to justify, paying taxes, following the rule of law, like why we should, respect our political leaders, so reading it in this context changes the meaning of that story, of that parable. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think this is one of the most misunderstood examples of Jesus' teachings that I can think of, because the way that I have typically heard this, and I don't know if you've heard this or not, but I have heard a lot of people say, well, this is Jesus endorsing the separation of church and state, which is an Enlightenment idea, right? He couldn't have been endorsing the separation of church and state because that idea, that concept, wouldn't be invented for almost 2 millennia. It wasn't something that he could have even fathomed. And so instead, I think it's really important to understand this because I think it shapes the way that Jesus' followers relate to government.
Very much.
And so Borg and Crossan point this out and they say, okay, someone brings him or someone asks him, should you pay taxes? And that's a controversial issue.
Right.
Are taxes, they're not controversial today, right? I mean, we've overcome that.
Well, it depends on who you talk to, right? Like, some people don't want to pay as much. Some people, and then, you've got I had a lot of very radical friends who have stopped paying taxes for, that's radical too. Like, I'm too afraid to not pay taxes, but, ask me a little bit more about whether or not I want to and where my money's going.
It's controversial, right? Because on the one hand, you've got taxes that support the war machine. On the other side, you've got taxes education,
social services,
right. It's a very controversial thing. Even today, I mean, I remember being in like 5th grade and a teacher trying to explain the difference between the political parties and describing the difference primarily in terms of how we pay taxes, which is the most biased explanation of differentiating political parties I can think of. But it's controversial, right? So it was super controversial in Jesus's day because the Jews didn't like the Roman oppressors. I can't imagine why. And the Romans imposed taxes, and those taxes went to then further Roman oppression. So
Hmm.
you can understand why
Yeah.
that's not really a popular tax to pay, right? They
Right.
wouldn't have wanted to do that. So all the people who were listening there, and
Hmm.
the Gospel of Mark says there were a lot of people, and they were spellbound by Jesus's wonderful teaching. So those people would not have wanted him to say, "Yeah, go ahead and pay the taxes to the empire." On the other hand, we had the religious establishment who was colluding with Rome and who
Hmm.
was in charge of keeping order. And if Jesus had said, "No, don't pay taxes," well,
Right.
that would have been anti-imperial,
Right.
and it would have been grounds for a sedition charge.
Hmm.
And so what he says instead is,
Give unto Caesar. Oh, wait. Yeah.
the things are Caesar's.
Yeah. And give to God what is
Well,
God's.
it's God's, right? Well, we all know
Yeah.
that verse, and so right, it's Jesus says, "Bring me the denarius, day's wage," and on
Hmm.
the front is the Roman emperor,
Right.
and on that coin is also a claim that the
He was the
emperor is
Son of God.
the Son of God.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so if you got the coin and you looked at it and you saw the emperor and it said that he's the Son of God,
Hmm.
how how would you respond to that?
How would I respond?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm a chicken. So I probably just would have been like, I don't know. I don't know how I would have
Here it
responded,
is,
honestly,
Caesar.
Caleb. Like, I'm a chicken. I would have probably been among the 12 disciples and just been like, let me hide in the back. I wouldn't have answered
So
it.
that's a really good point, right? Because we see the disciples mostly silent
Yeah.
in these narratives,
Yeah.
which becomes important for Mark later. And so Jesus kind of says, "Give to the emperor the things that are the emperor's," and he makes this claim, right, that the coin has the emperor's face on it,
Hmm.
and it says that he is the Son of God. It has blasphemy on it to
Hmm.
the Jewish people, even if they didn't say anything about Jesus being the Messiah.
Right.
The claim that Caesar was the Son of God and had
Hmm.
his image on the coin was blasphemy. It was
Hmm.
idol worship.
Right.
And so, as Borg and Crossan point out, a lot of them refused to carry a denarius.
So what did they carry instead?
So they
And I
carried.
did not know this, by the way. I loved this. I didn't know this. I have never heard this.
Yeah.
Please explain it. I think this is so cool.
Yeah, so they had their own
Hmm.
coins, and that did not have graven images on them, because all the Roman coins had either an image of Caesar
Hmm.
or an image of animals, and
Hmm.
so that was contrary to Jewish teaching, and so they
Right.
could not carry those
Right.
coins, except for the people who were in charge and did carry
Right.
those coins, and so it was an indictment against them for carrying.
For being
That's right,
hypocrites.
and worshiping their true God, right?
Right. Oh my gosh. How do we not talk about this at all? Because I think that's a
Uh,
really important
yeah,
way. I mean, without that historical fact,
yeah.
the whole parable is misinterpreted.
Yes, that's right.
I thought that was so cool.
That's right. So it's an indictment of people worshiping money and colluding,
Hmm.
and ultimately, one point that Borg and Crossan make as well is that everything ought to belong to God, and
Hmm.
so it's having people choose. Once again, just like on Palm Sunday,
Hmm.
are you going to join the parade of power and
Right.
violence, or the parade of nonviolence and
Hmm.
peace through justice? Are you going to worship money and
Hmm.
empire, or are you going to worship God who calls us to care for the vulnerable?
Right.
And so this to me is just the perfect example of
Hmm.
how we have to keep these teachings within their
Yeah.
context to understand what they really mean, because this is actually a very central
Right.
teaching to what it actually means to be a
Right.
Jesus follower. And
Yeah.
it's not about separation of church and state, which I think is a good idea, by the way. It's
Yeah,
just
I
not
agree.
Jesus's
Yeah.
idea.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly. And it's okay that it's not Jesus's idea,
that's
right?
right.
Like that's a part of history. As we evolve, we learn
Yeah,
more about science, as our government and just everything, our social
yeah,
structures evolve. We learn more, and we can still apply these principles to our current day
yeah.
situation. Like we can still look at what he's trying to teach and state in there. That story really blew me away,
Mm.
as did the others. But I do agree this is probably one of the most important ones to come out of Tuesday, also, and a great example of how They really tried to back him into a corner to get
Yeah.
him in trouble, to try to get him out of the way. And he didn't fall for their traps at all. So I liked that.
I think another important point about Tuesday, and then we need to move on to Wednesday, is that at the end of the day on Tuesday, they are leaving Jerusalem,
Mm-hmm.
and they look out and they see the enormous stones of the temple,
Mm.
and uh, Peter says, "Oh, look at these stones! Isn't this beautiful?" And Jesus says, "Not one stone will be left unturned." Right?
Right.
And so this is actually one of the most important verses in the entire Gospel of Mark.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that they tell us, and is actually kind of one of the cornerstones of New Testament scholarship, is that this gives us the date for when the Gospel of Mark was written,
Oh, okay.
because this is making reference to an actual historical event,
Mm-hmm.
which is the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in the year 70 of the Common Era. And so
Right.
scholars pretty much universally agree that that's what this verse is about, whether they're conservative or more
Mm-hmm.
progressive scholars. They all agree that that's what's happening here.
Mm-hmm.
And so that gives us the date. So we know that this is 40 years after Jesus' crucifixion.
Mm-hmm.
It also helps us to interpret the verse that Jesus is not actually predicting the future,
Mm-hmm.
that the temple is going to be destroyed, but rather it is speaking to a historical event that
Mm-hmm.
Mark would have known about,
Mm-hmm.
and in doing so, Mark uses it as a way to indict the temple leaders. And so I thought that was
Oh.
kind of brilliant writing,
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
both use his own context and to use that in a way that
Mm-hmm.
indicted in the narrative the
Mm-hmm.
temple leaders.
Mm-hmm.
So
I like
that's an
that.
important event in Tuesday, but we've got to move on to Woman's
Women's
Wednesday.
Wednesday.
So
Yeah.
why did you pick that name, Marcella?
Oh my goodness. So I was I mean, there was again a lot that happened on Wednesday,
Yeah,
but particularly the focus on the disciples
yeah,
and questions that they had and arguments that they had
yeah,
and trying to be the first and
mm-hmm,
all these things. We hear all those stories a lot.
yeah,
At least I did growing up in church, and we continue to hear them. But we do hear the story, but the one that really stood out was the woman who anointed Jesus, right?
mm-hmm,
And they did point out there is another story in the Gospels, not to be confused with that one, but this one in particular, and you can explain it probably a little bit better and put it into context. But this one was very important because she was the first to truly understand what it meant to follow Jesus. So when I talk about being a chicken, and I probably would have been standing to the back, like I love to think that I'm super radical and I'm doing all these things to stand up against oppression and against, the current empire and everything. But truth be told, like there is some hesitancy in
yeah,
doing that. I probably would have been one of those disciples in the back biting my nails, being like, I know I should say something, but I'm not.
yeah,
We don't talk about women being, well, this, woman being the first to truly follow Jesus. And alongside
mm-hmm,
her were Mary Magdalene,
mm-hmm,
Salome, and other women.
yeah,
Like, I think they got it. Like, they make this point
mm,
that she got it first,
yeah,
and we highlight the 12 disciples and make such a big deal of them. But what
yeah,
about the women,
yeah.
right? So that really stood out to me enough to say, you know what? Like, let's call this Women's Wednesday because women were the first to get it.
Oh, I like that. And Morgan Crossan even goes so far as to call her the first Christian. And
Right.
I thought that was very significant. The
Right.
first Christian, the first real Jesus follower. And
Mm-hmm.
so, one thing that we sometimes miss in these anointing stories is that the anointing that they are doing is what you would do to a king. So,
Mm.
whenever someone became a king, they were anointed with oil on the head. So, this wasn't something that was readily available, the oil, it was
Right.
expensive. It
Yeah.
was not something that just anybody could buy. And
Mm-hmm.
so the fact that she is realizing Jesus's messiahship, his leadership, even his kingship,
Mm-hmm.
right? She's choosing the reign of God over the Roman Empire or any of the colluders who are technically in charge of her people, that she is choosing Jesus instead. And so
Mm.
I think this story is especially symbolic
Mm-hmm.
because we've got a marginalized person, a
Right.
woman
Right.
who didn't have many rights, right? And she's doing the anointing, not at the temple,
Mm-hmm.
but in the home of a leper
Wow.
who was ritually unclean, right?
Right.
So the place where Jesus is named the Messiah is in
Mm-hmm.
a leper's home by a woman.
Right.
And if that doesn't tell us
Mm-hmm.
what the values of the reign of God are in
Right.
comparison
Amen.
to the Roman Empire
Right.
and to the colluders and the religious establishment, I
Right.
don't think anything does.
Yeah. Yeah. We don't talk about that enough either. Like the location of where she
Yeah.
anointed him,
Mhm.
who she was. And then also when they mentioned the other women too, like, they mentioned Salome and Mary
Yeah.
Magdalene, who had basically helped provide for his ministry, right? So these are
That's right.
women
Yeah.
that somehow or another, helped provide and
Yeah.
finance his ministry. Like
Yes.
how cool is that? And yet
Yeah.
we're the marginalized, we're the,
That's right.
and especially in those times,
Yeah.
they weren't very important.
Yeah.
That is very cool. That is really cool.
I think Jesus seemed to over and over again try to dismantle the gender roles that the society had put into place. And
Mhm.
so we see that over and over again. And yes, you're right that women are specifically named as his benefactors. So it's safe to say that Jesus could not have been in ministry without the women funding his ministry,
Mhm.
and that his message was super radical. It's as time went on that people are like, "Ooh, that's too
Mm.
radical. Maybe we ought to tone that down a bit." Which
Right.
leads me to maybe an important suspect who
Mhm.
emerges
Mhm.
in this narrative, and that's Judas.
Oh boy. Well, we
Judas.
all know he betrayed Jesus, right?
Oh,
We've seen the movies, we've
oh,
heard the
oh,
story.
right, right, and that is one of the pieces that we often hear about during
Mhm.
Holy Week. And so, what do you think about Judas as a suspect? And maybe more importantly, what do you think his motivation was for betraying Jesus?
Well, one thing that stood out to me while reading
Hmm.
this is that perhaps I don't know his motivation,
Hmm.
really. Like, I think I do because
Yeah.
I've seen the movies,
Yeah.
where it's money,
Yeah.
right? He wanted to get paid, but they point out that the leaders said they would pay him, not that
Yeah.
he asked for money,
Yeah.
right? Then something that emerged in my mind too as I was reading was maybe he just wanted to be careful.
Hmm.
Like, I'm talking about being a chicken standing
Yeah.
to the back,
Yeah.
like maybe it's an easy place to be like, here, let's just eliminate this person so that
Yeah.
I don't get in trouble and I
Yeah.
don't end up on a cross and arrested and on a cross.
Mm.
So maybe there was some fear behind it so that the 12 and the other
Yeah.
followers that were clearly there with him didn't get in trouble. I don't know.
Yeah. And I think Borg and Crossan really drive that point home that we actually don't know his motivation in the Gospel of Mark. We are not
Mhm.
given that motivation. I think, though, that we are meant to infer something
Mhm.
because we read the story about this unnamed, which is another point of marginalization, right? She doesn't
Mhm.
even get a name. This
Right.
unnamed woman anointing Jesus, which was taboo. She was touching him, and
Mhm.
he was not her husband.
Right. True.
And she was calling him the king through this anointing. And it was in this home of the leper. And immediately after this very scandalous incident,
Mhm.
we find Judas going to the religious leaders.
Mhm.
And I think we're meant to infer that this was too much for
Mm.
Judas.
Mhm.
That the boundary breaking that Jesus was doing
Right.
was simply too much.
Right.
We've got the day where we are staging an anti-imperial parade. We've gone and we've done a demonstration in the temple. We
Mhm.
spent Tuesday confronting all the religious leaders, and then on Wednesday, we go and there's this woman touching Jesus,
Mhm.
anointing him, calling him the king.
Mhm.
I think we're meant to infer that that was too much for
Right.
Judas. And so it wasn't actually greed, I don't think. Although we get that explanation in other gospels, but I don't think
Mhm.
that's what Mark is telling us.
Mhm.
And I think you're right. I think it's fear
Mhm.
because it was too much and discomfort. And to me, that also symbolizes that, like, Jesus's message can sometimes feel like too much,
Yeah.
too radical,
Yeah.
even today.
Yeah. Oh, I think it's so much easier to accept this idea of Jesus died in my place for my sins,
Mm-hmm.
and then so that I wouldn't have to face that punishment.
Yeah.
It's so much easier to accept that
Yeah.
than it is to see this message and hear this message and say, oh, shnikes, like I have to now be the one to, like if I'm a follower of Jesus, I literally have to follow what he did, which means standing alongside the marginalized, being with some people that, might not be the most agreeable. They might not, they're marginalized for a reason a lot of times. And not that that's justified. That means I have to stand up against oppression, which might even mean me not paying taxes. I don't know to what degree am I going to choose to follow Jesus and stand up in the same way that he did. And right there, he's calling us to follow him to death, right?
Yeah.
Like, if you're going to do this, jump in head first. So I think I would find discomfort in that. And I still do.
Yeah.
So much easier. Just like, Jesus, thank you for dying on the cross for my sins. And now I'm a good person. And now, like that's a much easier message to swallow for me.
It is.
Not that I like it.
It's easier and it's empty. And that's why a lot of people choose that because it doesn't require. And I've also got to say, I love that you said shnikes. And so Borgencrossen talk a lot about how the disciples misunderstand and then we misunderstand.
Right.
And thinking that he is atoning for sins when he's not asking that he's not telling them that he is dying on behalf of sins, but instead he is saying that they are to participate with him in the events that lead to his death, even as they're standing back. And so I think that raises both Judas on the suspect list and it raises the disciples in their complicity because Borgencrossen also make it very clear that the disciples don't seem to have much interest in participating with Jesus.
Right. Well, there was one important part too, where we misinterpret a lot of times where they going back, like, who do you say I am? And so, and also like here, like, they really want him to be the Messiah.
Yeah.
And Jesus literally says, shut up.
Yeah.
And not like, shut up, like, shh, be quiet. We really don't want people to know that I'm, the Messiah.
Right.
But it's really interpreted as be quiet because you're wrong. Like, this is not what this is about. Like, this is, like, I really liked that. But, they're wanting to elevate Jesus and wanting to approach his message very differently than what he's asking of them. And they don't quite get it.
Yeah, that's really important because that in Mark is called the messianic secret that Jesus is always telling them, don't say that I'm the Messiah. And that was something that I deeply appreciated here was part of the reason for that is because they were interpreting it wrong. Like if they had said he was the Messiah who was going to do what a Messiah was supposed to do, which was overthrow Rome and reestablish a united kingdom of Israel, that was a seditious act. But the kind of Messiah he wasn't that kind of Messiah, was the kind of Messiah who wanted a non-violent revolution of the heart. So, woo!
That's a lot.
Oh, man. Okay, so a lot happened on Teaching Tuesday and Women's Wednesday.
Yeah.
And so I can see how this was a week that ended up with Jesus on the cross.
Right. Yeah. I mean, he's already given them a lot to, to condemn and to induce fear and panic.
Yeah.
I think in leaders, both Jewish leaders and obviously the Roman Empire for sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
So next week we'll go to a familiar day, which is Maundy Thursday. So we hope that you can join us next week on Who Killed Jesus, a true crime podcast, as we look at Maundy Thursday.